Hello, and welcome to my presentation of ancient Egyptian religion. My name is Miss Gabry, and today I will be walking you through the different aspects of the ancient Egyptian religion. In this lecture, we will cover various topics such as deities, the afterlife, tombs, and more. The learning targets for this lesson are as follows. I can analyze the different parts religion played in Egyptian civilization and be able to describe the important cultural and scientific legacies that originate in ancient Egypt. To start this lecture, we will be completing a bell work. Make sure that you jot this down in your notebook for future use. Today's bell work reads, "Why is Egypt considered the gift of the Nile?" You will have about 5 minutes to work on this bell work before we go over the correct answers. So normally in a class, I would have an on-screen timer just so students can keep track of their time as they work through the bell work. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to skip over that and go over the answers now. So there are a few correct answers for this spell work. So the key concepts that students need to understand is that the Nile regularly floods, and this flood brings in a substance called silt. This silt is a type of soil that is usually black or red in color, and it is rich in minerals that are very important to farming. So the Nile also provides natural barriers which protects its people from invasion. The Nile also provides an abundance of food, water, and resources for the Egyptians. If you take a look at the map located on the screen, you'll see that the areas around Egypt are super dry, but the little strip right in the middle that corresponds with the Nile is very green in color. This shows you just how important the Nile was to the Egyptians, because without it, the civilization would not be able to happen where it's at. So now that we've completed the bell work, let's move on to the actual lesson. So now we will discuss the difference between polytheism and monotheism. So let's start with the word polytheism. If you break the word down, you get two words. You get poly and theos. Poly means many and theos means God. So essentially, the word polytheism means many gods. So the word's definition is belief in many gods. People who practice polytheism are called polytheists. Examples of this religion include the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, and the Mesopotamians. So now let's look at the word monotheism. Mono means single, and we already know theos means gods. So this word means belief in one God. People who practice this form of religion are called monotheistic. Examples of this religion are Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So as we just discussed, ancient Egyptian religion was a polytheistic religion, which means that they worshipped many gods and goddesses. Many of the gods and goddesses were represented as animals, and because of this, many Egyptians believed that animals were of religious importance. A perfect example of this is the special treatment that Egyptians had for cats. Cats were well respected and had elaborate funerals because the cat was a symbol of one of the goddesses, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later on. Egypt was divided into different regions. Each region had its own patron or god that was assigned for that specific area. The Egyptians believed that the gods and goddesses created the universe out of chaos, and in order to maintain a peaceful balance, they must appease the gods by performing certain rituals and ceremonies. So now we'll be going over a list of the gods and goddesses that we will be covering in class. I recommend writing these names down in your notebook with their associated titles. I know these names look pretty intimidating right now, but don't worry because I will break them down in simple pronunciations for you. The first god is Ahmen-Ra. He is the sun god. You can easily pronounce his name if you break it down into Ah-men-Ra. Ahmen-Ra. Your next god is Osiris. You can easily pronounce this name by saying O-Si-Ris. Osiris. Osiris is the god of the dead. Isis is the next goddess. You can pronounce her name by saying Ice and Sis. Isis. Isis. Isis is the goddess of protection. Next we have Newt. You can pronounce this name by saying Newt. Newt. Newt is the sky goddess. Next we have Seth. Seth is a pretty easy one to pronounce, so you don't have to practice this one. So Seth is the god of chaos. Next we have Horus. Horus sounds like the word horse, but with an us at the end. Horus. Horus is the divine protector of gods and pharaohs. Next we have Anubis. You can pronounce Anubis by breaking it down into a new bus. Anubis. Anubis is the god of the dead and the god of embalming. Next we have Hathor. An easy way for me to remember this one is to think about the Avengers. So you have Hathor. Hathor. Hathor is the goddess of motherhood. Next we have Bastet. You can pronounce this as ba, like a sheep makes, and set. Basset. Basset is the goddess of love and childbirth. Next we have Tooth. So you can pronounce this by saying tooth, kind of like the teeth in your mouth. Tooth. Thuth is the god of the moon. Next we have Gab. Gab is the god of the earth. Next we have Shu, like shoo, fly, you're bothering me. So Shu is the god of peace, lions, air, and wind. And last, but certainly not least, we have Tethnot. This is probably one of the harder ones to pronounce, so we can break it down into Tethnot. Tethnot. Tethnot is the goddess of moisture and rain. Alright, so as we discussed in some slides earlier, a lot of the ancient Egyptians are represented by animals. So in hieroglyphs, you can normally see this half-human, half-hybrid form. So we're going to go over how each god and goddess was represented. So we are going to start with Ahmen-Ra, or just Ra for future purposes. Ra is usually depicted as this hybrid form. So if you look at the slide, you can see he's got a normal human body. He has a falcon head. Above his falcon head, we have this red circle. This red circle is called the sun disk, because remember, Ahmen-Ra is the sun god. And encompassing the circle, we have this cobra. These are all normal representations of what Ra looks like. Next, we have Osiris. Osiris is typically represented as a mummified king, because remember, Osiris is the god of the dead. So if you look at him, his arms are crossed like a mummy, he's carrying these staffs, and he's wrapped all the way down to his feet. So this makes sense because, like I said, he's the god of the dead. Next we have Isis. Isis is usually represented as just a human woman with the headdress that is shaped like the throne. Because remember, Isis is the goddess of protection, and the pharaoh is typically an image for protection. So if you take a look at the slide, you can see this is kind of shaped like a throne, and she is fully human. Next we have Seth. Seth is a really hard one to depict because he's the god of chaos. He takes on many forms, such as having a pointed snout, a tail, rectangular ears, a thin canine body, having a forked tail, sometimes as a red-headed beast with cloven hooves, or a griffin, or just any kind of really horrific beast that the Egyptians could come up with. But for the purpose of this class, we're going to refer to Seth as looking like what's on the slide. So if you look, he's got this long pointed snout. He has long rectangular ears, and he's just got his human body. And then if you look closely, he's got this tail. So next we have Horus. Horus looks very similar to Akhmun-Ra, just because they both have bird heads, but make sure you study these images because this one is a hawk and the other one was a falcon. Now, when you look closely, he's kind of got a shorter beak and it's not curved like a falcon's is. Also, their headdresses are different. So make sure you keep these differences in mind when trying to determine the difference between Akhmun-Ra and Horus. Next we have Anubis. Remember, Anubis is the guide of the dead and the god of embalming. So if you look at the slide, we have this image right here. This is what is referred to as a jackal. So it kind of looks like a dog. It's got long pointed ears and kind of the long doggish snout. So just kind of remember that this is a jackal. So along with the jackal head, he just comes with a normal body. He kind of has this tail right here, but really the most important thing about his image is this jackalness. So the jackal will become a very important image for death in Egyptian culture. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the mummification process in the next few slides. So just for the purpose of right now, just remember that Anubis is represented as a jackal. So Hathor was a little bit more difficult to find a picture of. So obviously the picture doesn't look like the other ones. So Hathor was generally depicted as having like cow-like ears or even just being a cow. And I know that sounds really odd, but we have to remember that Hathor is the goddess of motherhood, and cows are very protective of their offspring. So this and the idea of the Egyptians made sense to them. It was something that they knew and they could relate to. So that is why Hathor was depicted as having cow-like features. So if you look at this picture, again, I know it's not like the other ones, you can see that she's got cow-like ears. You can also see she's got a very broad, flat nose, which is very typical of a cow. I am sorry that this isn't the same picture style as the other ones, but it was the best representation that I could find. So just when you think of Hathor, just think of a cow, and you should be able to remember it. So the next goddess we have is Bastet. Like we mentioned earlier with Hathor, Bastet is another good example of why animals were considered religiously important in the Egyptian culture. So if you look at the screen, we have Bastet. Bastet is usually depicted with this cat head or feline head in a human body. Now if you remember, Bastet is the goddess of love and childbirth. Now cats birth a lot of kittens at once, which is part of the reason why she is depicted as a cat. The next god we have is Thoth. Thoth, in my opinion, is the neatest representation, and that is because, yes, he's another half bird, half man, but this bird is very specific. So if you remember, Thoth is the god of the moon. So if you take a look at his beak, this beak is a curved shape. Now this is very intentional because if you ever think about the moon phases, there is a phase of the moon called a crescent moon. This is just a little sliver in the sky that you see sometimes. It kind of looks like a fingernail. Now keep that image in mind. Now look back at this bird. This curve is very similar to a crescent moon, and that is why Thoth is represented as an ibis. Next we have Newt. Newt is usually depicted as a dark-skinned woman, typically black or midnight blue. She is standing on the tips of her toes and the tips of her fingertips. This is because if you look at the slide, right where the pointer is pointing would be Earth. So this makes sense because remember, Newt is the sky goddess. So if Earth is here, she represents the sky, which is above the Earth. So next we have Geb. Geb is represented usually as a man. He's usually in the prone position, which just means he's laying down. And then he usually has some kind of goose feather or even a goose head I couldn't find very good representations of this, so I kind of made this image. So he's got his human body, if you look at the slide, his human body, and then he's got a goose on his head. I know that's kind of silly, but it does help you remember. The Egyptians believed that geese were a really good representation of the earth, which makes sense since Gab is the god of the earth. Now, him and Newt are usually represented together. Let me get my little diagram out. So, remember, Newt is the goddess of the sky. So, you can see my diagram. You can see Newt is stretched out like the sky. And then underneath, you would have Geb. Since Gab is the earth, it makes sense that he is under Newt. So this is kind of like your sky and then your earth. So they're usually depicted in hieroglyphs together, but I wanted you guys to be able to recognize their differences separated, and this is just a little fun fact. So next we have Shu. If you remember, Shu is the god of air and wind, with a few other things attached to his title. So he's usually depicted with a ostrich feather. So if you look at the slide, this is how they represented ostrich feathers. Ostriches are a really fast bird, so they associate that with the wind. He is also usually in hieroglyphs represented with Geb and Newt, because Newt is the sky goddess and Geb is the earth. So I have another diagram for you to make it a little bit easier to understand. So like before, we have Newt stretched out as the sky, and then we have Geb laid across in that prone position as the earth, and then between them we have Shu. So this makes sense because between the sky and the earth we have air, or else we wouldn't be able to breathe. So just remember that in hieroglyphs, they will be typically represented like this. Again, I wanted to show you what they looked like separated, just so you can get a good mental image in your head. And it's just kind of an interesting fact to know. So Tefnut is usually depicted as either a full lioness or just with a lion head. So if you look at the screen, she's got this lion head. This wasn't particularly important because, like I said earlier, that the Egyptians kind of had different regions, and each region had its own patron or god and goddess. The specific city that Tefnut was worshipped in was basically translated into the lion city, so this is a big impact on how she was represented. And because she's the goddess of like moisture and stuff, she's got a high connotation with the sun, because you know if you lay out a water bottle in the sun, it starts to condensate or gets wet on the outside. So this is why she's got this sun disk above her head, similar to Ra. So this isn't necessarily something you have to memorize. It's just more of a fun fact for you to kind of give you a better idea of the relationship between the gods. So if you remember when we first introduced the gods and goddesses, I talked about how Amun-Ra is the most important god. This is because he's the first god. So if you look at this family tree, you can see he's the head of the family tree. From him, all the other gods and goddesses were born. Now, you might think it's a little weird of their relationships because they're siblings and then they have children, but this was a total normality in Egyptian religion and just fact of life. A lot of the pharaohs were born this way. So it is just something that's very important in the Egyptian culture. So this is going to be the first myth that we talk about in this class. It's one of the first ones that originated, so it's one of the most important. So it goes like this. Ra ruled over the world by himself, and then he had his children. Remember, think back to that family tree that we just looked at. One of his children was Nut. Now, after he had Nut, he had a vision that Nut's children would overthrow him and he would not be all powerful anymore. He wouldn't be the most important god. So he cursed Nut not to have children within the 360-day year. Now, I know what you're thinking. Miss Gabry, a year is 365 days. Well, not at this point in time. This point in time, there was only 360 days within the calendar year. Now, this is very important because when Nut seeks out the help from Thuth, which is the moon god, this is where he comes up with the solution. Because Nut was only cursed to have children within the 360-day year, he created 5 extra days that weren't within the calendar year. And because of this, Nut was able to have children, but only within those 5 days. And because of this, now we have the 365-day year, according to the Egyptian beliefs. So this is the next myth we will be discussing. This one is a little bit more lengthy and has more details in it. This is a very significant myth, and this is why we're going to spend a little bit more time on it. So if you remember, Osiris is one of Nut's sons. Now, Ra was afraid that Nut's sons would overpower him. Osiris kind of did this. Osiris and his wife Isis learned how to get onto Earth. So they went to Earth and became all-powerful and was worshipped by the people. They were loved and adored for teaching them ways to survive, how to farm wheat, do all of these things that bettered their civilization. So the people adored Osiris and Isis. So Seth, his brother, became very envious of this. He wanted that adoration that Osiris was getting. So he gathered all of these people to blindside his brother. He commissioned this very elaborate tomb to be made. It was decorated with jewels and ebony. It was just very elegant. And he brought it to this party that he threw for Osiris. Everyone loved it. They wanted it. It was beautiful. It was like a precious gem that everyone wanted. So he said, I will give this to anybody who can fit into it. But here's the kicker. He took the specific measurements of his brother Osiris and had those measurements made into the tomb. So only Osiris can fit in it. So this was a trap. So Osiris was like, oh, I want this beautiful tomb. Like, this is a beautiful addition to my collection. I want it. Let me try to get in it. So he got in it. And because it was made for his body shape, he fit perfectly. So Seth sealed him away in it and threw him into the Nile and became the ruler. Isis was devastated because her husband was gone, so she went looking for him. She eventually found him and pulled him out of the water. Now Seth heard of this and rushed to her side. He was furious. So he used all of his anger and his abilities and tore apart Osiris's body. It's believed that he was torn up into about 14 pieces and spread them across the world. Everyone was astonished because you couldn't destroy God's body, but yet Seth did. So the world kind of went into chaos. Isis ran away in hiding. She was pregnant with her son, and her son was Horus. Now, Horus will become a key factor in this myth. Horus was born, and then Isis went and looked for all of the pieces of her husband, Osiris. So she ended up finding all of the pieces except for one, and she starts putting him back together. And then Horus takes vengeance on Seth because Seth killed his father. And this is when Horus will become known as the divine protector and god of pharaohs. So Isis is able to put her husband Osiris back together, and then when they go back to the afterlife, the other side, Osiris is able to live again. Now this is important because this is what inspires the Egyptians' ideas of embalming or preserving the body, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Alright, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to discuss what the pharaoh's role was in the Egyptian religion. So the pharaohs were believed to be divine or godlike. So the pharaohs were the intermediary for the people and the gods. This means that they were the person who act as a link between the people and the gods to ensure that the people are appeasing the gods' needs. So the pharaohs maintained order in the universe by performing certain rituals and offerings. Individuals could personally interact with the gods by doing this in their homes or in temples, but typically it was the pharaoh's role or the pharaoh's job to appease the gods to protect their people. So the Egyptians believed in life after death. They believed that the gods controlled whether or not they actually moved on to the afterlife. This is why it was so important to appease the gods during their lifetime. This is why their rituals were so elaborate, why they performed sacrifices and did those things. They also made great efforts to make sure that the soul survived after death. They made sure that they did good deeds, they were a good person, so that way when they were judged, they would be deemed worthy of moving on. They also created this system called mummification, and this was to preserve the body so that way the soul had a body in the afterlife. They also created these elaborate tombs that protected the body. These tombs also had specific items in it that would be used in the afterlife. So as we just discussed, the Egyptians believed in life after death. So they often compiled their tombs with special things like food, spices, drinks, slaves, pets, gold, pottery, furniture, offerings to the gods, all of these things. All the things that they think they could need in the afterlife, because in their mind, the afterlife was basically life on earth, but when you were dead. This is why grave robbing was so horrible in the minds of the ancient Egyptians, because grave robbers not only just stole wealth, but they risked stealing the ability of someone moving on to the afterlife. Because if they stole the offering to the god and the god was mad, that person wouldn't move on into the afterlife. That's why things like the pyramids were built, because that way it deterred people from actually getting to the goods and the people could actually move on to the afterlife. So you might be asking yourself, what exactly is mummification? What is this term that she keeps throwing around? Well, mummification is the process in which you preserve the body. Now, why would we preserve a body? Let's think about food that you might be bringing for lunch or that you might get at lunch. What is done to that food to ensure that it doesn't go bad and spoil? It's wrapped up. So it's wrapped up to keep the air and moisture from getting to it, which stops it from going bad. This is the same concept that we use when talking about mummification. Mummification is a process to ensure that the bodies don't decompose. So the Egyptians were able to develop a process called embalming. The Egyptians believed since they needed their bodies in the afterlife, they needed to embalm people so the bodies would not decompose. So embalm is just a fancy word to say preserve the body after death. You can also think about if you've seen people dissect frogs, those frogs were embalmed to make sure that they don't go bad. So the embalmers removed all of the organs except for the heart, because the heart is very important when it comes to the afterlife. In the next few slides, I will explain its significance. So after they removed the organs, except for the heart, They filled the body with all kinds of mixtures of salts and herbs and wrapped it in linen to keep it from the elements. This process took about 70 days to complete, and the priests who did it wore the masks of the jackal. Remember earlier when I said that the jackal is an important figure in death because the jackal is the god of embalming? This is that perfect example. So these priests wore the jackal mask to represent the god Anubis. So again, the jackal represents death. Alright, so we understand that this is a 70-day process. Now let's explain why it was 70 days. So the body was actually washed and purified. So it was purified by like holy water and the priest praying over it and all of that stuff. So really nothing was done until that process was done. Next, they typically removed the brain, which sometimes didn't happen, but it usually happened. Fun fact, they would remove the brain by going up through your nose and your sinus cavity and pulling it out, which is very weird to can think that you could do that, but that was the typical process that they did. Next, on the left-hand side of the body, they would make a small cut, and through that small cut, they would remove the lungs, the stomach, the liver, and the intestines. Now, the intestines were put in separate jars called canopic jars. Now, remember, the heart was not removed during this time because it was thought to be the center of intelligence and emotion and would be later used in the afterlife to judge whether or not they would move on. So I just mentioned this word canopic jars. I want to make sure you understand what they were. So the canopic jars were each different and they housed different things. They had different heads on the jars which represented different sons of Horus, so the protectors. The canopic jars were placed in a special chest within the tomb of the pharaoh to ensure that they were all there. So there are typically 4 canopic jars, and I've been practicing the pronunciations of these, but they're pretty difficult to pronounce. So the first one you have is Imsati. Imsati has the head of a human, and it housed the liver. Next canopic jar, we have K Ben Sinif, which had a head of a falcon, and it guarded the intestines. The next canopic jar we have is Happy. Happy was a head of a baboon and it housed the lungs. The next canopic jar we have is Mu Anuf, which is the head of a jackal and it protected the stomach. If you look at the chart on the screen, you can see that how they're represented, and they were usually pretty close to the body in the tomb, just to make sure that all the parts were there. So now that we kind of gave a clarification on what the canopic jars are, we're going to pick up with the 4th step of mummification. So the 4th step of mummification is the body was typically covered with natural salts, and this helped dry the body out and stopped the decaying. The 5th step was resin-soaked linen would then be inserted into the body through the small cuts, and this was so that it would fill the empty spaces, because if you didn't do that, the body would concave on itself, or like if this was the stomach, it would be sunken in because there'd be nothing there to support the stomach. So these linens actually helped keep the shape of the pharaoh. This was more of like a cosmetic procedure, but they wanted to make sure that the pharaohs and stuff looked good in the afterlife. So the idea to keep the pharaohs looking their best in the afterlife actually brings us to step 6 of the mummification. So step 6, they would actually bring in makeup artists to ensure that the pharaoh did indeed look their best. These makeup artists would not only just put makeup and wigs on the pharaohs, but they also concealed the scars and would stitch the wounds from the procedures previously. So step number 7, oils of myrrh, juniper, and crushed thyme leaves would then be used to make the body not smell bad. It'd kind of be like perfume or cologne that people would use these days to make sure that they smelled good, because a decomposing body does not smell nice. And then step number 8, pine resin would actually be melted on top of the body. This provided a waterproof coat, so that way it protected the skin from the water and would also delay the decay process. Step number 9 is the process of which the body was then wrapped in linen. Different shaped charms would then be placed between the layers of linen. These charms were believed to help them in their process of moving on to the afterlife. The charms are also believed to be spelled to also function as aids when the pharaohs were going through their trials in the afterlife. So the last step of the mummification is that masks were then fitted with the pharaoh's name and then was attached to their heads and their bodies, and then they were placed into the casket or the tomb. This is typically called a sarcophagus, and these were also very decorative and had really cool things on them. Each one was specific to that individual pharaoh. So now we understand all of the steps that the pharaohs and Egyptians used to make it to the afterlife. But we haven't really discussed what exactly the afterlife was. So the afterlife was considered to be like a heavenly place. The Egyptians would refer to the afterlife as the land of the two fields. The Egyptians believed that Ra chose whoever would enter the land of two fields. In the beginning, only pharaohs, however, could enter the afterlife. After Osiris became the god of the dead, after he was killed by his brother and all of that stuff went down that we talked about earlier, he changed it that only those who qualify for the afterlife could actually get into it. In order to qualify for the afterlife, you had to earn your weight. You had to go through several trials and pass what's called the feather test, and then, and if only then, if you passed, you could move on into the afterlife. If you failed those tests and trials, your soul would be devoured, which is a pretty scary thing. This is why the Egyptians were so considerate of themselves and they're following the laws. If you actually look back in their government records, Egypt had a very low amount of crime, and this was because they were fearful that in the afterlife their souls would be devoured. So the final test to determine whether or not you made it to the afterlife was considered the feather test. The feather test was administered by Anubis. Anubis would take the heart. Remember, the heart was left inside the body during the mummification process. They would take the heart and measure it against the weight of a feather. The feather represented truth and honesty. So they used this old-fashioned scale. So if you look at the screen, you can see in this hieroglyphic depiction, this is what the scale was. And then there's a heart on one side, and then the feather on the other. So this person right here is being tested to see if he can move on to the afterlife. So they believed if your heart weighed less than the feather, you were an innocent and good person and could move on to the happy fields. But if your heart weighed more than the feather, you were deemed guilty and a bad person, and your soul was fed to the devourer of souls. As I've previously mentioned, only pharaohs were admitted into the afterlife at first. After Osiris became god of the dead, he kind of changed this and created these trials and tests that if people passed, they were able to get into the afterlife, such as the feather test that we talked about in the slide beforehand. This kind of goes along with why the Book of the Dead was created. So you might be wondering, what exactly is the Book of the Dead? So the Book of the Dead is just this list of like spells and answers and stuff that were supposed to help the individual make it through the afterlife. So if you look at this picture at the bottom of our slide, you can see that there's all the different gods and goddesses laid out right here. So in this depiction, this is actually a good representation of what the trials were to get to the afterlife, because each individual god and goddess had their own sort of test that the individual had to pass in order to get to the afterlife. So that's a lot of tests that you need to pass in order to make it to the afterlife and not get your soul devoured. And then I don't read hieroglyphics, but all of my research has said that each of these little panels of hieroglyphs are also additional trials and tests that the people needed to pass in order to get to the afterlife. And as you can see at the bottom, this is another representation of the feather test. I talked earlier about if you failed the feather test, you would be devoured, or your soul would be devoured. Your soul would be devoured by something called a mit. A mit was this creature, like in the bottom right-hand corner, that was usually shaped like a crocodile, or sometimes even a dog, but typically a crocodile, and it would just eat your soul. So this is why the Book of the Dead was so important. The spells and answers inside gave you a better chance to pass the trials. Some of the things inside of it included giving the individual the ability to control their own body, which was essential, because how can you pass a test or a trial if you can't control your body? Another one, we give them the ability to speed up, like go faster through everything and get through the test faster. So these are just really small examples of why the Book of the Dead was so impactful for the individuals, because they couldn't do the elaborate offerings, like the common people couldn't do elaborate offerings, they couldn't do specific rituals, they didn't have as much wealth to be able to offer the gods and goddesses like the pharaohs could. So the Book of the Dead kind of evened the playing field for the more common person to be able to make it into the afterlife. Now I would like you to take the next 5 minutes to watch this video. This video is true to its title. It explains how to navigate the Egyptian underworld. This video highlights the importance of having the Book of the Dead. It lets you have a clear understanding of exactly what it did and how it aided the Egyptians in their journey to the afterlife. So this does bring us to the conclusion of our lesson. So you will be completing this 3-2-1 activity. I know we've done 3-2-1 activities in the past, but I'm going to go ahead and go over the directions again just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So for this activity, I would like you to list 3 things that you've learned about ancient Egyptian religion, and then 2 things that you found interesting and you would like to know more about. And then I would like you to list the minimum of 1 question that you still have about ancient Egyptian religion. If you have more than 1 question, go ahead and put it in this section, because later in the future I will be making a separate PowerPoint that answers all of your guys' questions just to make sure everyone is on the same page. Now you will be graded on the content accuracy, so make sure that it indeed does follow the ancient Egyptian guidelines, or ancient Egyptian religion guidelines. You will also be graded on complete sentences, so make sure you're not just writing little thought bubbles down, but you are writing complete sentences. You can access this activity by clicking the click here on our PowerPoint or through our virtual classroom. You do have to make sure you hit submit at the bottom of the form to make sure it comes through. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.